About 2 years ago, my family had our first experience with our ghost when one night, my older brother got up to go to the bathroom. While he was there, he heard a screeching noise from behind the shower curtain. It got louder and faster as it continued, and he ran out of the bathroom and into my room with his trousers around his ankles. He called for me to come into the bathroom. Drowsily, I got up and we started down the hallway. We never did enter the bathroom because we were both much too freaked out when a shampoo bottle came hurling out of the bathroom door, hitting the wall opposite it and rolling down the hallway. I slept in his room that night. After that, we had many encounters with the ghost that we began to call Christine, after the famous Stephen King novel. Though I personally never witnessed her, both of my parents and my friend did. My mom was the first. One night, my friend Midge and I were asleep on the living room floor when the alarm on Midge's cell phone went off at about 3 a.m. It didn't wake up Midge or I, but my mom got up and came out into the living room to turn it off. She saw who she thought was me standing in the hallway on the other side of the room, but she ignored me to retrieve the phone and silence it. That's when she noticed I was asleep on the floor beside Midge. Scared, she went back to bed. Later that night, Midge woke me up crying and insisted that I just shaken her awake, then ran into the kitchen. But when she looked over, I was asleep next to her. Several weeks later, my dad was pulling into the driveway late one night and thought he saw me sitting on the couch, pulling back the blinds and staring out the window. As he pulled close to the house, I put the curtains back and got off the couch. But when he came into the house, he discovered that I wasn't even home. I was spending the night with a friend. In between these experiences, eerie things occurred around our house. The silverware dresser would fly open and slam shut. Doors would open, close, and lock by themselves. Lights would turn on and off. Then, a very strange event occurred when I made a collage on my wall of pictures of my friends. I had about 200 or so pictures completely covering one of my walls, which took me a very long time to do. I went to bed and awoke the next morning to find that every last picture containing Midge had been taken off the wall and was in a pile across the room with all the other pictures. And that is the end of my story. I lived part-time, if that makes sense, with my dad in Whitmore Lake, Michigan, before he passed away last year. One night, it was about 2 a.m. My dad was out somewhere, and my brother and sister were asleep in the other room. I was sitting at the computer, talking to my friends. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something peeking around the corner of the room I was in, right at me. Usually this happens a lot to me, and then when I look at it, it disappears. Frightened, I turned slowly to look at it, and it stayed there, just staring at me. I wanted to puke. It was extremely tall, maybe 7 or 8 feet tall. It had long bony fingers and long, sharp nails. It had long gray hair, and its face wasn't that of a person's, but looked decayed or like a monster. I got very scared, and after about 3 or 4 minutes, which it seemed longer, it slowly backed away from the wall. I told the person I was talking to on the computer what was happening, but for some reason, I was too scared to get up to call my dad. I ran upstairs, and when I turned the corner to go up the stairs, I saw it again, standing at the top of the steps. I'm a huge scaredy cat, so I was freaking out, and I had tears in my eyes. I ran up the steps with my eyes closed and ran into my room. I turned on my light and checked in the closet and under my bed. Then I slammed my door and locked and laid in my bed until I fell asleep. The next day I woke up and went downstairs and saw my dad in the kitchen. I told him about the previous night, and before I could even describe what the creature looked like, he already knew. He told me that he saw it all the time. He told me just to ignore it. My dad was definitely not a religious person, so it bothered me that he was okay with the crazy thing just staring at me, or anybody. To this day, that was the scariest thing that has ever happened to me. I don't like to tell too many people, because they just look at me like I'm crazy. And now I wonder if the thing had any connection to my dad and his death. About a year later, he got me heavily into drugs, and it was going downhill. And even after he lost his huge house in the lake, that he spent his time and money and energy building, he still wouldn't leave the home. He lived in between the home and his neighbor's house, in his camper. In July of 2004, my dad intentionally decided to leave the world. It makes me want to go back and investigate. That's my story. Anyway. I grew up in an old house in the rural area of Sandy Lake in Stonesboro. It was built around 1847. On the bottom floor, the walls were 16-inch stone. The top floor was built during the time the brick builders traveled through Mercer Company. Our kitchen was on the top floor, and outside the door was this large lilac bush. We milked cows, but I didn't care for milk. But each night after dinner, I had to sit until I drank my milk, and my parents went into the living room. It was a nice night, because I remember the door was wide open, and I saw an old woman come up the walk. She had her hands wrapped in her apron. I turned my head to yell at my mom to tell her we were getting company, and when I turned back, the lady walked around the bush. When my mom got there, I told her about the lady, and she got very pale and called my dad. And I had to tell him the story. And being 6, I didn't understand their looks. Dad went on to prove to me that there was nothing there, but I saw her. As I grew, she stayed, and often just stood there outside my closet door. Even as a teen, she caught me from falling out of bed one night. I never enjoyed her being there, but tolerated her presence. Dad later told me it was probably my grandmother, who lived down the road and passed before my birth, and she always folded her hands in her apron when not busy, as idle hands were the devil's plaything. The house is still there, and I wonder if Grandma's there too. I would like to share a story about my friendly, and sometimes not so friendly, ghost mother-in-law. I moved in with my boyfriend, now my husband, shortly after I left my last husband in Colorado. He had a son who lived in the basement of the home he inherited from his mother. My boyfriend lived upstairs, and he and his son had established a rather bachelor existence, coming and going with no notice, dishes everywhere, etc. My arrival was not met with joy and friendship from his son, because I brought structure and responsibility into the home, as well as rules. Family was very important to my then boyfriend. His son tried to emulate him as much as possible. My mother-in-law made herself known to me right away that she did not like the disagreements and bad feelings in the home by removing items from the kitchen and around the home, some that have never resurfaced. I spent a great deal of time in the home alone, so I think I was aware of it the most. Plus, I was the only one who did dishes. Anyway, time went on, and things disappeared, only to reappear in the weirdest places. Wooden spoons, which were obviously favorites due to their worn condition, disappeared and reappeared and disappeared completely, never to return. My husband, who was one of the most difficult to convince of supernatural occurrences, when he saw his mother in a blinding white light standing in our hallway, he said I was sound asleep right next to him. She then faded to nothing. The last occurrence was when I was thinking really bad and evil thoughts about a coworker of mine while doing the dishes. The dishes were many and stacked all over the counter. I was concentrating on what I was doing in the sink, washing dishes, when all of a sudden a landslide occurred, sending several sharp knives flying, as well as a cobalt glass globe tea light holder my girlfriend had just given me, crashing to the floor. I was thrilled to see it hadn't been broken, except for one large piece that could have been glued back. As I was crouching, looking at the glass globe without picking it up, bad and evil thoughts all ran rushing through my mind. I watched the antique knife sharpening steel literally hopped off of its nail and crashed to the floor, flipping several of the items already on the floor, smashing hard into the cobalt tea light holder, crushing it to smithereens. Since the nail had a large head, and the circular hook on the end of the steel was somewhat ornate, you had to lift it off the nail, over the head to lift it off the nail. I never doubted again the thoughts or things, and my mother-in-law, who hadn't put an appearance in years, thought I should be aware of that, telling me to stop sending bad thoughts into the atmosphere. She always seems to appear during times of stress, not exactly a comforting spirit, but one telling you to buck up and get over it. I was staying at a friend's house a couple of years ago, and she did warn us that it was haunted. Of course, I didn't believe her, but after seeing this, I do now. Unfortunately, there is no evidence or photos, but I swear that I've seen a ghost. Anyway, there were the three of us sleeping in my friend's bed. They were asleep. I was not. I looked to my left at a blank space in the wall, right above my head. And to my absolute shock, a hand began to move through the wall. I thought it was just my imagination and woke my friends and just pointed at the hand coming out of the wall. We jumped out of the bed and ran to the opposite side of the room and waited. The hand began moving out of the wall, and attached to the hand was the body of a woman. Now, it wasn't what I imagined a ghost would look like, all floaty and transparent. It just looked like a woman standing there. She was about 5'2", which was about my height, and she was dressed in black jeans and a button-up white shirt. She was barefoot, long brown hair. She stood there for what seemed like ages. It was only about 2 minutes, but that's all she did. She just stood there, and then she turned, and she walked back through the wall. To this day, I will never forget what she looked like. Unfortunately, as I've said, there was no evidence that would make you believe me. No one else does either, but I swear that I've seen a ghost. I happened to stumble upon your site, and I found it very fascinating. I thought I would share something that happened with my family with you. We live in the UK, in a small town called Stanley, in Durham. My mom, my little sister Rebecca, who was a week away from her 5th birthday, and I were going into the town center when Rebecca stopped at the top of the hill, and then she turned around. She pointed to the golf course that you would see from the top of the hill, looked at my mom and said, "That's where I crashed my plane when I was a man, Mommy." She then began to stress that she saw a figure standing right there, just waving at her and smiling. Rebecca then waved back, and we asked her what she was waving for. She proceeded to tell us that her friend Billy was waving back. We didn't see anything and shrugged it off. We both laughed it off and said, "Come on, don't be silly." But she went on to tell us that she was flying with her friend Billy when they lost control and crashed, and that they both died, and how she thought it was nice she could still remember Billy. When we searched it just out of curiosity, it turned out that a BE-2C had actually crashed there in October of 1916, killing both of its pilots, who are both members of the Royal Flying Corps. Unfortunately, no names were listed, so we could not see if Billy was there. How else would a girl who was not yet 5 and could not read well enough to research some things like this know that this was the place a plane crashed and killed the pilots years earlier? I recently returned from a visit to my boyfriend in the beautiful state of Pennsylvania. On one of our day trips, he took me to Pithole, a large oil boomtown with a lifespan of 500 days. Since it was fall and late afternoon, we were afraid the visitor center wouldn't be open, but we were jovially greeted by 3 members of the staff who told us we were just in time for the movie. Entering the small theater, we joined a couple and their 2 giggling girls. 20 minutes later, my boyfriend and I started down the hill to what was once Pithole. In the meadow, you'll find descripting markers of the buildings and the streets, a few old wells, and holes in the ground, which were once cellars. We were reading the markers and snapping pictures when I saw my boyfriend stop in his tracks and shake his head. I asked him if he was okay, and he said he was, so we continued walking. I kept hearing a conversation between a man and a woman and assumed it was the couple with the girls, so I kept looking up the hill to spot them. We got to the end of the street and were talking about French Kate, a brothel manager, when it got really cold. I could still hear the man and woman talking, but my teeth were actually chattering and I was having trouble breathing. I grabbed my boyfriend's hand and started up the hill, thinking we might be having an experience, but not wanting to say anything. He asked me if I was okay. I told him I was, but it was so cold down there, I was having trouble breathing. As we walked up the hall, the temperature rose, and I was breathing easier. Once we got home, we talked about what we both experienced. My brother stopped in his tracks because he saw the back of a woman in a dress walking behind a tree. We both heard the conversation and felt a drastic temperature drop. I was the only one who felt breathless, but I guess we all have different reactions to experiences. I kick myself now for not taking any pictures, but I guess I was trying to rationalize everything. My name is Brittany, and I live in Greenfield, Massachusetts. I always thought I was crazy when I was little. Now I know I'm far from it. Okay, so I was about 5 or 6 at the time. I live in an old big whitish grayish house on woolly Greenfield. I had 2 imaginary friends when I lived there, Hada and Heidi, a little boy and an old lady. I I used to always play with them, and my mom was a little confused at the time. Like, is it normal for a little girl to have an old lady as an imaginary friend? But they were my best friends. I used to go in my basement with them and see things, like a man in a suit, standing and reading a book. I would run upstairs and tell my mom, but she would never let me go look. So we moved about 5 years later into a house on Greenfield. This house was worse than the last one. I was about 11 or 12 when we moved, and I live in this house still. And I walked into my room 4 or 5 weeks after we moved in, and I saw two little girls. They were in pink and white frilly dresses, rolling a blue ball back and forth in the middle of my room. I screamed and ran out of my house. I called my mom at work and told her the story, and she said it's okay. They won't hurt you. I've seen them too. I was absolutely shocked that she said that, but I went back about 6 hours later, not to find anything at all. My phone rang 2 times before the answering machine picked up, and the smell of cigars filled my house. When I listened to the phone, there was two little girls talking on the other line. So I picked up the phone and said, "Hello, who is this?" And they hung up. So after 6 months of me and my mom getting hit on the back, or tripped, or lights clicking on and off, we decided to go to the library to get some kind of history on our house, and the old house as well. We found out that the house that I lived in when I was 5 or 6 was an old funeral home, and my imaginary friends were far from imaginary. The house we live in now is an old boarding house, and the little girls have no records of ever living in the home. They don't bother us anymore, but you can still feel them every once in a while. Once, when I was around 5 years old, we were visiting my grandfather. He lived in a small town near the northeast corner of Colorado. My grandfather's house was very old. The only indoor plumbing that it had was a kitchen sink, but even that was somewhat antiquated. The water would come out of the faucet, but it had to drain into a little pot that sat on the floor underneath it, which then had to be tossed out of the door. To go to the bathroom, we had to go to the outhouse in the backyard, which in itself was rather scary. The house was surrounded by trees, and I seem to remember that there were railroad tracks nearby. One night, during the particular visit while everyone was in bed, my brother in the front room on the couch, my grandpa in his room, and my mom, dad, and me in the second bedroom, a strange occurrence was about to happen. It was pitch dark, and I was lying in the middle of my mom and dad, which made me feel very safe and secure. I was wide awake and happened to be looking in the bedroom door. That's when I noticed that someone was walking through it. My mom and dad were both still in bed, and this did not look like my brother or my grandpa. It looked like a very small woman wearing a veil, with her head slightly bowed. Anyway, she, or whatever it was, walked past the brass footboard of the bed, went to the window, turned around, walked past the foot of the bed again, and then out of the door. The image was extremely bright in the otherwise dark room, and I did not feel frightened by it at all. Now, the next story scared the living daylights out of me. I was around 10 years old, at home, in a very unassuming bi-level brick house. My grandfather's house looked the part for a haunting, but this one, not even close. It was just your average everyday home. However, something not so average was about to take place in it. It was in the middle of the night, and for some reason, I woke up. From where my bed was, I could look straight out into the living room, which I just happened to be doing, and that's when I noticed the dark image walking out of the kitchen. It walked into the stairs and stood there for a few seconds. I concluded that this was my dad, about to go downstairs to check on my brother, who was a teenager at the time, to make sure he had come after being out with his friends. But he seemed to change his mind about doing this as he turned and started walking towards my room, which was nothing out of the ordinary, because he had to walk past my bedroom to get to his and my mom's room. He stopped at my door and stood there looking at me. I finally said, "Hi, Dad." I got no response. I looked at this dark image more closely and noticed that it was staring at me with big, dark, hollow eyes. No, this was not my dad. And in spite of the fact it was not threatening me in any way, I lost it and started screaming. This screeching woke my mom, who rushed into my room, running right through the dark figure, and it vanished. I slept on the floor in my mom and dad's room for about a week after that. I would like to tell you of an experience my husband and I had when we were living in an old house in the village of Alumnance, North Carolina. We lived in this house for 2 years and discovered we had another child in our house other than our 2 children. You could sit on the couch in our living room and out of the corner of your eye see the shadow of a small child, female, maybe 3 years old. I know this was not my own children because my daughter would be in school and my son was an infant. I never said anything to my husband until he saw it and told him I had seen it several times, but didn't say anything to keep from being accused of being crazy. That spring, I was reworking my flower garden in front of the home, and as I cleared away the grass to extend my borders, I found a brick etching in the ground about the size of a small child's grave. I've never been able to find out any history on this land. We have since moved from the house, but I've always wondered who this little child was and why she is still at this home. We never felt uneasy in this home. My mother was very young when she had me, so when I was growing up, my grandmother would help me out a lot. I was very close to her, having been her first grandchild. I know she loved me very much. When I was 17, my grandmother developed heart problems and had to have surgery. She was in the hospital for a long time, never really getting any better. Then one cold night, my mom was going to the hospital to see her. I really wanted to go, but I was very sick with a high fever, so we didn't think it was a good idea for me to visit her. I went to bed around 12:10 a.m. I remember the time because I looked at the digital clock next to my bed. On March 10th, 1991, I was awakened out of sound sleep by the feeling of someone squeezing me so hard I almost couldn't breathe. That lasted for about 3 minutes, and then I felt a feeling of extreme sadness. I brushed it off, as I must have been hallucinating due to the 104 fever, and fell back to sleep. About 40 minutes later, my mom returned from the hospital and woke me up to tell me my grandmother had passed away. I sat up in my bed and asked when, and my mom told me around 10 after 12. I cried, and then I told my mom what happened. I had such a close relationship with my grandmother. I really felt she wanted to say goodbye to me and hug me one last time before she left this world. Hey guys, the video is now almost over, but wait, before you do that, I'm about 200 subscribers away from the big 30K. I should have said 300 and wait, I should have said 30K. Anyway, guys, I'd really appreciate if you left a like on this video immediately, if you left a comment, because I'm back, baby. I'm doing YouTube videos again. But yeah, no, guys, it really helps if you left a like. And if you're subscribed, if you're not subscribed, please comment below and let me know which story you like the most and everything else. Share the video out to all social media. Let's get the algorithm in my favor. Because, with small YouTubers, they don't like us. So guys, I'll leave you alone. Love you and see you in the next video.